Here now is Democratic Congressman Steve Cohen from Tennessee. He serves on the House Judiciary Committee. So, Congressman, I know you're going to have academic witnesses for the first Judiciary Committee hearing. Are you going to have any fact witnesses? Are you going to want to hear from Rudy Giuliani if he does come up, or say there is some quick court ruling that allows other people to testify? Would that go to Intel, or would it go to Judiciary?
I don't think that's been determined, and I think Speaker Pelosi with Chairman Nadler and Chairman Schiff would make that decision. I really don't think the courts are going to have anybody come in very soon. I think the Trump team's going to continue to stonewall and appeal and appeal and appeal. And all of the folks we're talking about, Bolton and McGahn, have long-standing relationships with Republicans and have been, Bolton's got a book deal and McGahn's got a law practice that are really dependent a lot upon their history in working with the Republican team. They're not going to jeopardize that, you know. So I don't see any great change coming in that card. You might have these two fellows, Parnas and whatever his name is, the team from Ukraine, that maybe they would be available. But I imagine Schiff would want to interview them first. But that's a question's beyond. It's over my pay grade.
Well, let me ask you this. Are you confident that you'll be able to convince the American public that this stonewalling by the White House, this delay tactic from the White House means that you just got to move now? Or are you a little bit concerned that there could be some people out there that say, hey, listen, they might be stonewalling, they might be trying to run out the clock, but I really do want to hear from these people before I personally make a decision on whether or not I want to see the president impeached?
Well, I think there'll be some people there, but it's not going to be a great number. I think when you see the polls say 50% of the people want him impeached and removed from office, those people are going to support the Democrats. It's a big number, and they're going to support the Democrats. They're 43%, which is basically your Bush bottom line, that do not. But some of those people might be people that don't want him impeached and removed from office, but might not mind him being impeached and as a blemish and as a record, but don't want him removed. And then you got the other 7% that are obviously out there too. His only hope is to get all those, keep the 43, get the 7, because the 50 are gone. And obviously the 7 are if they're in a question spot, they're more likely, in my opinion, to lean against the president, because the president has been shown to have done a lot of harm. It's clear that he's abused his power. It's clear that he's tried to use his office to benefit himself politically and personally, which is not what he's in office to do. And it's jeopardized our national security, and it's subverted the Constitution. And people will see at least part of that, open-minded folks. And I think those 7% are probably the most open-minded of the group, not having kind of made a decision. And when you're open-minded, you'll see the facts as being damning to the president and damning for our country. Our country's really, it's at stake. The Constitution's what we're about. It's not just a piece of paper. It's not just something you read about in history. It's a living, breathing embodiment of the United States of America and what it stands for, and it's under attack.
I've spoken to fellow members of your committee, Congresswoman Madeleine Dean and Congressman Jamie Raskin in the past couple of days, and they've walked us through how this first House Judiciary Committee hearing is going to look. They're going to explain what an impeachable offense is, what a high crime and misdemeanor is, line up what the president did with what Nixon did, line it up with what Clinton did, and try to show the American public how egregious the president's actions were. I know you're calling academic witnesses. I haven't seen anybody say who exactly those witnesses are. Can you tell us?
Well, I don't know. I've been told that they will be top flight and the best that you can imagine. Lawrence
Constitutional
Schwab,
lawyers,
specifically
that sort of
about.
thing?
I was told. Yeah, Lawrence Schwab's not going to be one, but there'll be others. And for some reason, we're not going to have Professor Schwab. But we will have people that you know of who are experts in the field.
The White House, or we've now learned from the New York Times, that the president knew about the whistleblower report in late August. What does that do to the timeline?
Well, it shows that he had a reason to say loudly to Sondland, I don't want anything, that no quid pro quo, because he knew that the trouble was coming down the line and that he'd been caught and the jig was up. Mulvaney saw it when he went back to try to justify their actions after he found out about the Intelligence Committee report, and he tried to find a way to justify it. The president saw the same thing. They knew they'd stepped in it, and it was sticking, and they started to smell it.
Congressman Steve Cohen. Congressman, happy Thanksgiving. Thank you very much for joining us.
Happy Thanksgiving to you, Katie, and may your turkey smell better than my description.
We're going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.